comes to us from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, and I invite you to follow along on the screen, or if you also prefer, you can get it out on your phone and look it up that way too. We're going to be digging deep into this, but hear these words from Jesus. For the kingdom of God is as if a man going on a journey summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. The one who had received 5 talents went off at once and traded with them and made 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had the 2 talents made 2 more talents. But the one who had received the 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. Then the one who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more talents, saying, Master, you handed over to me 5 talents. See, I have made 5 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of the master. And then the one with 2 talents also came forward, saying, Master, you handed over to me 2 talents. See, I have made 2 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. Then the one who had received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But the master replied, You wicked and lazy slave! You knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow and I gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one with the 10 talents. For all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for the worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. You never quite know what the pastor is going to say after a scripture that ends with weeping and gnashing of teeth. But I'll start with a different story. There are many things that I love about being a pastor, but relationships are pretty much on the top of that list. I've only been in ministry for 9 years, but I have met so many interesting people, and I'm so grateful for all the ways that I've been welcomed into people's lives and stories. And this is my 3rd appointment, and when I think about my first 2, there are people that come to my mind when I think about them. And so for my first appointment, it was at a little church called Park Avenue UMC in Chambersburg, and Lowell comes to my mind most often. Lowell was a man of short stature who was over 80 years old when I met him. I don't remember his exact age, but he lived right at the end of the street from the church, and there was not a time in his life where he was not a part of Park Avenue. He was born and raised in that church. His parents were founding members of the church, and he never got married. He never had any kids. The church was his family. He spent 4 days a week at that church. He would come on Sundays, and he would come before our main service to put the bulletins out, to make sure everything was set up right. There were things that he did that we had no idea. It just happened because Lowell was there. And then he would come on Mondays when people would come in to count the offering, and he would count with them. And then he would come again on Tuesdays and Thursdays to help with whatever was needed, so folding bulletins or newsletters or filling up the oil in the candles. Lowell was your guy. He would talk to anyone that came in there, and he would sometimes be the annoyance of our office administrator because she couldn't get work done because Lowell would keep talking to her. But we all loved Lowell. And one day, Lowell didn't look well when he came to church. And that continued, him not looking well. And so we said, Lowell, maybe you should go see your doctor, see what's going on. And he was proud that he hadn't gone to a doctor in over 20 years since he had been retired. So soon after that, his neighbor found him collapsed in his house through the window. And that led him to a hospital stay, then to a rehab facility, and then back to the hospital. I don't remember all the details, but it was a rough time. When he was in rehab, I remember going with someone else from the church to get a list of all the things that he did, because we felt like we were falling apart without those little tiny details that Lowell always took care of. And we missed him. We cared a lot about him. He was our family, and I could only get information about his health through his cousin, who was his closest relative. So his, power of attorney, and they weren't even that close, so it was hard to get information. And I don't remember how I knew, but I found out that things weren't going well eventually, and I found out that Lowell didn't have much time left. And on that day, I had a meeting in the evening, and I remember at supper back at home, I said to Richie, maybe I should just skip this meeting. Maybe I should just go and see Lowell, because I don't really need to be at the meeting. And I was conflicted. I was still new in ministry, wanting to be at every meeting. But I chose to go to the meeting, thinking I'll just go and make a point to see Lowell tomorrow. I got a call the next morning that Lowell had died overnight in his sleep. And I know that Lowell is at peace, and I have so much hope that he knew that his family, his church family, loved him. But I will always regret not going to see him that night. It's not something that keeps me from getting sleep now. I've seemed to let it go a little bit, but I'll always regret that. I'll always regret not being there because we were his family. There was no one else that was there for him. And so to only be a reminder that he wasn't alone in his final hours. And I felt in a way that I had failed him as his pastor by not being there. I wonder, when was the last time that you felt like you failed? We can probably think of times when we experienced wasted opportunities or when we missed the mark. It might have been a deadline that you missed at work or the assignment at school that you turned in late. Maybe it was when you missed your kid's game because you had other commitments. Maybe it was a bad financial investment, something that you really hoped would be a success and it looked promising, but then it flopped. Or maybe it was a financial investment that you didn't take that you wish you had. 4 years ago, we all wish that we had invested in Zoom, right? Total missed opportunity. The hard part is that when these kinds of things happen, when we have repeated regrets and failures and missed opportunities, when that becomes the norm in our life, we suddenly start to organize our lives around avoiding them. So we don't commit to anything then. We turn inward and we isolate. And that fear can make us very small, make our lives very small. I think today's scripture helps us to think about our failures and missed opportunities in a new light, but it is one that's difficult to read, right? The ones that end with weeping and gnashing of teeth usually are. So I want to take some time to walk through this together. And again, if you want to follow along in your phone, this comes from Matthew 25. The story is we're going to walk through it together a little bit. And for those of you who don't know the term parable is a very churchy word, but a parable is a story that Jesus would tell quite often to help make his teaching more relatable to his audience. So first, there are some things that this parable is not. It's not a justification of slavery. It's also not a justification of the gospel of economic prosperity. So it's not saying, it's not telling you that if you are you will become financially rich if you give your wealth to God. That's not what this story is saying. Also, the analogy in the parable of God as the master only goes so far. There's some things that are troubling when we see God completely as that master. So we must be careful if we try to read into God's character through the lens of the master of this parable instead of seeing the ways that we might be called to respond as a result of this story. So we need to look beyond some of those things to focus on the big picture here. As you heard just moments ago, in this story, a man goes away on a trip. He entrusts his property to 3 of his slaves, each of them according to their ability. Different translations will use different words for what he entrusts them with, and I was tempted to use some of the translations that talked about coins or bags of money, but this has often become known as the parable of the talents, so I kept that word talents in there. And we might ask, I did as a kid reading this, how can somebody give somebody else a talent, right? Here's what we know about that word in this context. 1 talent is equal to about 6,000 denarii. Now, we also don't know denarii very well, so 1 denarius was the average daily wage of a day laborer. So if we do the math, 1 talent then equals about 20 years' wages of an average worker. Just 1 talent. That's amazing, right? So the one who got the least amount still got an incredible amount of money. And then the one who got 5 talents got about 100 years of wages of an average worker. That is an astronomical amount of money, right? 100 years of wages. You might start to wonder what kind of person had that obscene amount of wealth, and we might be able to think of a few people that we know that do, that don't know us, certainly. The first 2 slaves in this story are given 5 and 2 talents, and while the master is away, they decide to trade it and invest it, and they may end up making double of what they were given. So just think of how much higher that is than what they were given. But the third one, who's only given 1 talent, he decides to dig a hole in the ground and hide that money. Now, this might seem odd to us today, but back then, that was a common practice to bury treasure at the time. Now, at first reading, we might not think it's that big of a deal, right? He's being cautious. He just wants to keep it safe. He might even be expecting the master to come back, and then he can say, here's the money that you trusted to me. You can count down to the last penny. It is all there. I kept it all, and nothing more and nothing less. Here it is back. And let's face it, he could have done a lot worse. He could have squandered it like the prodigal son that we read about not too long ago. He could have gone on a shopping spree. He could have done some serious wining and dining with all of that money, but he maintained what was there. Nothing more and nothing less. He seems pretty trustworthy to me, but the master is furious. He commends the other 2 who grew the amount that he had, and he entrusts them with even more, but he's beyond angry with the third one. The judgment of a weeping and gnashing of teeth is not a happy one, when all he did was give him his money back. He played it safe. But that's what Jesus is getting at in this parable. That's what's at the heart of all of this. Commentator John Buchanan writes this: the point here is not really about doubling your money and accumulating wealth. It's about living. It's about investing. It's about taking risks. The greatest risk of all, it turns out, is not to risk anything. Not to care deeply and profoundly enough about anything to invest deeply, to give your heart away and in the process risk everything. The greatest risk of all, as it turns out, is to play it safe, to live cautiously and prudently. The third servant explains that he hid the money out of fear because he believes that the master is harsh. But I wonder if there also isn't a fear of repeating past failures. He was only entrusted to 1 talent, and all the other talents were given according to their abilities. That's what we're told. And so he might have felt put down when he starts to compare himself to his other counterparts. You entrusted them with 5 and 2 talents, but you only entrust me with 1. That fear then only led him to squander the opportunity that had been given to him. If the master didn't think that much of him, well, then he wasn't thinking much about himself either. I wonder if you've ever squandered an opportunity because of the fear that what would happen if you took a risk. This week, I attended a conference online called Level Up. Last year, the same conference happened out in Pittsburgh, and a group of us went to it. It was a great conference. It was the pilot for our dinner church and a lot of other discussion. But this year, the timing was hard for me to get away and make the trip, so I watched online. And one of the workshops was led by author Roger Ross. Some of you may recognize that name because he was the author of the book that we did a study on, Come Back, just recently, that inspired our sermon series as well. And I was really excited that those online we didn't get to choose our workshops. That was chosen for us to watch online, and I felt like I was fangirling from the other side of the screen because I loved his book so much. But he talked about the difficulty that people and organizations have with revitalization because of the change that has to occur. He talked about a study of a group of people who had serious health issues, and each one of them was given a chance to change their lifestyle dramatically in some way, or those health issues would cause them to continue to decline and to die sooner than if they were to make those big, drastic changes in their life. Out of this group of people, only 10% made the changes that needed to be made, did the hard work of making the drastic changes to change their health, which means that 90% of the people chose decline and death instead of change and life. Because change is hard. But here's the thing. You don't grow without change. Growth equals change. It means change, right? But you also don't change without loss. So change also means that there's a loss of some kind. And any kind of loss means pain, right? It's painful when we lose something. And so growth then also means pain. And that's often why organizations don't grow, because there's pain when change happens. So what pain are we willing to choose? Are we willing to choose the pain that leads to death? Or are we willing to choose the pain that leads to life? We have been entrusted, each one of us, with amazing gifts. Some of you have the gifts of music that is beautiful and gives us so much life into this place. Some of you have the gift of hospitality, and you are able to walk up to complete strangers and talk to them and make them feel welcome here. Others of you have the gift of making really good coffee to get us started in the morning. Others of you have the gift of technology, and goodness, that is so helpful because y'all can hear me right now, even those online, and you can see what's on the screen. And it all gets online in a crazy, magical way that I wouldn't be able to do because that's not my talent. That's not the gift that God gave to me. Some of you have the gift of teaching, and without it, our kids wouldn't be able to hear God's love and a message that is right for them and speaks right to them in their language. And we wouldn't have a place then for adults, all of us, to grow and to discuss our faith with one another without those teachers and leaders. Some of you have the gift of organization. Some of you have the gift of financial management, which is so helpful. Some of you have the gift of seeing needs that no one else sees, and you just go and you get it done. Others of you have the gift of generosity, and you long to give what you have whenever the opportunity comes. You just give. Whatever your gift is, though, God has entrusted you with it. God trusts you with your gift. And it's a gift of grace. It's the grace of God at work in your life that makes you uniquely you. God gave it to you and trusted you with it. And of course, it's a risk. It's a risk to use what God has trusted you with. It's a risk to put yourself out there because you might fail. It might just flop. You might not have time for some of the things that you enjoy doing because you'll put yourself out there and use your gift in other ways. It might mix up your schedule a little bit. Your generosity might mean that you can't eat out as much. It might mean making more coffee at home than stopping on your way to work. It's hard to put yourself out there and to do something that is out of your comfort zone and out of your routine. And it's much easier to just keep the status quo, to keep things as they are. But if you're not using your gifts that God has entrusted to you, when you're not taking that risk and using what God has given you, well, then you're not experiencing fullness of life. It doesn't happen. You see, the master had entrusted this third slave with a part of his property so that the slave could use his abilities that the master knew he had to turn a profit for him. And these had been abilities that the slave must have used them before under the master's eyes to see it in the past, or else he wouldn't have given it to him. He wouldn't have trusted him with that one. You know, he might not have been the best, but he might have said, I'll trust you with one and see what you do with it. Risky behavior was obviously part of the master's business, but the slave was too afraid to take that risk, and it cost him a lot in the end. There's one more thing I want us to notice here. The master doesn't respond to the slaves. At the end of the story, when he returns, he doesn't respond to the slaves based on the amount that they brought to him. He bases his response to them based on how they used their talents. Sometimes when we have less, or when we think we have less than others, we'll cling to what we have for fear of losing even more. And this isn't about giving beyond our means or beyond our time, but if God trusts us with what we have and what we've been given, then how are we trusting in God to give a portion of that away? If God trusts us with what God has given us, how are we then trusting God with how we use what we've been given? What would you do if you knew that you couldn't fail? Every time Lowell comes to my mind, I wish that I had a time machine to go back and make a different decision on the night before he died. And I don't know why I didn't just go. I don't know why a simple meeting that I didn't need to be at was holding me back. It wasn't my first misstep in ministry. I blame it on still being early in ministry. And it won't be my last misstep either. But my failure that night has also pushed me to try my hardest to be present and available to people in times of need and not to hesitate coming near when there's trauma that's happening. Missing that meeting, though, would have been worth the risk for Lowell to not be alone. What is worth the risk for you? This parable is the third in a series of 4 parables that Jesus tells back to back, and they all talk about the end times. That's why you hear the throwing into the outer darkness with weeping and gnashing of teeth. He's preparing his followers because it's not long after this that Jesus is arrested and killed, so he's talking about when he will return, which we have not come to see yet fully. He wants them to be prepared for when he will come again. Now, in the 4th parable, right after this one, he shows us the work that we need to be about doing. He shows us the work that God has entrusted to us. Jesus said that whatever we do for the least of these, we do to him. Some of you may know that this is familiar. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. That is the work that we are supposed to be about, that God calls us to be about. And friends, we are so good at going about that work. That's why we put 90 angels on that tree out there, because we knew that every one of them would be taken. We also knew that the youth's favorite night of the whole year is going to Target and buying toys for those kids, which is really cool. That's their favorite thing to do. Together, though, we can do so much more than we could ever do alone. And there is no shortage of ways in this place and outside of this place where you can use the gifts that God has given to you. There will never be a shortage of ways. Last week, we sent in the mail our giving statements up until the end of September. And with those giving statements was an invitation and this covenant card. This simple card is one way that you can make a plan for using the talents that God has given you in this place and in the community next year. And it's not just a financial plan, that's important, but there's a number of things on this card, and I invite you to start praying over it. In 2 weeks, we're going to have a big celebration where we'll all bring in these cards. We'll celebrate all that God is doing here, and after worship, we're going to have a pie contest because that was really fun last year. So if you want to make a pie, sign up. There's still space. And then after that, we're going to deck the halls for Advent and Christmas, which is one of my favorite things to do. So it's just going to be a great day in 2 weeks. Each thing that's on this card, though, is a risk. But I wonder if the bigger risk is to not make a plan at all. And you can do that. You can just put this in the trash or in the recycling, and I won't know. I probably won't find out. You can keep going as you are, but you could also take a step forward and trust God in the adventure of a lifetime. It's a risk, but anything worth doing is a risk, right? And I promise you, it is so worth it. I invite you to pray with me.